Muskegon, in a sense, has always been here. Even before it had its name, Native folks have lived here since time immemorial, and eventually Muskegon started to rise up as colonists came in as a trapping and fur city. And eventually the lumber took over more than the trapping, and it wasn't until like the late 30s that African Americans started kind of migrating up here, and then World War II took on. And there were a number of factories in the area that needed workers desperately to help keep up with the demand for making all the various aspects of tanks and things they needed for the war. And so there was this sudden influx or need of labor, and Muskegon just didn't have enough of it. So they would send people down to basically recruit from the rural areas down south, and I think they were called man catchers, and they would basically go down there with tickets and bus tickets and train tickets and try to lure people out of the fields to come up north and work. And the war was, progressing. So they were telling folks back home that they could come up north and make money in Muskegon, and people were sending back home for their relatives eventually. And so by the early to mid 40s, there was quite an influx. I think it was like 1.5 million African Americans started moving north just to look for opportunity. And even before that, it was up to 3 million people. But just in the 40s alone, 1.5 million people came north. Not all of them to Muskegon, of course, but a lot of them to Muskegon. And when they got here, they were given, of course, the worst jobs and the least paying jobs, but apparently that was still better than whatever they were doing down south. So they still encouraged family to come up, and there were housing shortages, no place for the people to stay, to rest up, to go to these, incredibly difficult jobs. I remember Dr. Jackson said, I think he worked in a foundry for a day or two, and that was it, And these are all quite skilled, intelligent people, Dr. Jackson later became a doctor. He was working there as he was approaching medical school, so an incredibly intelligent man, but he was regulated to working the lowest job, and that was it. There was no job growth, so that's the job you'd have for life. He would never progress anywhere if he hadn't, tried to seek opportunity elsewhere as well. But anyway, so there was a lot of housing shortage, and they came up with the concept of hotbeds, which is where people would share a bed because they couldn't find homes of their own. So there were certain areas you just couldn't buy in, and those were, where you could buy was very small and taken up quite quickly. So a lot of people had nowhere to go. They'd stay in hotbeds, which were, you'd have 8 hours to sleep in the bed, and then you'd go to work, and then someone else coming off of their shift would come in and sleep in the same bed, and it would just rotate like that through the 24 hours. And these would be in like people's basements and things, nothing very homey at all, you're in Michigan basements, which we all know are damp, and there's no accoutrements or anything, And eventually the government came in and opened up the Fairview housing projects to help give people a home. And so I think they opened up, like, I want to say 1,200 or so of those, 2 to 3 bedroom houses. And before that, people were living anywhere, like the hotbeds, rail cars, tents, you name it, So this was an improvement, and it had a community center called the Center. But, when the government comes in and does these things, it's often, they don't go above and beyond by any means. They'll do bare bones just to kind of placate the problem. And so it was a step up, but it still, there was a lot of room for improvement still. So as time went on, people were able to find more housing, but there was still a lot of people who were struggling with that. And, because of discrimination and racism in the area, it was still difficult to branch out and find housing outside of that. I remember Dr. Jackson talking about trying to buy his first home in the area and all the problems he ran into. And you have to have a lot of grit, to fight against that, to insist on something decent for you and your family. But eventually that all started, money was coming in, and people were getting a little better housing and more money in their pockets, and so more black businesses started to open up as the 40s went on and into the 50s. And that created kind of a renaissance in the area with a lot of black businesses and clubs, and a lot of, I guess you'd say, black commerce and security, And as the war passed and the need for all of that started to dissipate, Muskegon slowly started to decline, and everybody felt the effects of that, but certainly the African American population that's been here because of discrimination and all of that, of course they're going to feel the brunt of that the most, because whatever opportunities remained as things started to trickle away would naturally go to white people. And so Muskegon's been somewhat on a decline ever since, and a lot of the industry has since left, and people have started to struggle more and more. And you know, in the last 10 years or so, Muskegon started to try to turn around, and they're revitalizing the downtown after they tore out most of the historical downtown, which was just a crazy move in my opinion. And you know, now a lot of the things they're trying to build, a lot of the new homes down on the main strips are made to look old, you know, so they're trying to recapture what they got rid of for the old mall, which is what I grew up with. I grew up with the Muskegon Mall, and I miss even that, you know, because for years after they tore that out, it was just a hole. There's a huge hole downtown, that was it. So we've come a ways since then, but you know, in the 60s, you know, even with the money and the housing and everything, there was still a lot of problems and discrimination. So the Freedom Now Party came around, which Dr. Jackson was a prominent member of, and ran on that ticket for a while. And they had to do, you know, protests and marches and boycotts of Woolworths, I think it was one of them that Dr. Jackson did, just to get these places to allow African Americans to come in and shop, as a lot of their businesses started to close because of lack of funding and opportunity. You know, we were all integrating more and more just out of necessity. But Muskegon is still it's still a segregated town in lots of ways. There's a main drive, Seaway, that kind of separates Muskegon Heights from Muskegon. So we have a lot of work to do still as far as overcoming discrimination and prejudice and racism here in town. A lot of white people probably don't feel that way because it's not something they have to think about so much, you know. But I'm certain, you know, most African Americans in the area are quite aware of it, you know, because it's not that hard to see if you're really paying attention. And where Muskegon goes from here is really still a question mark, you know. They're working hard to revitalize downtown, but you know, Muskegon has all these pocket communities. There's Roosevelt Park, Muskegon Heights, Norton Shores, the city of Muskegon, North Muskegon. But they're all Muskegon. I grew up here, they're all Muskegon to me. And they all are adjacent. We all need to work together and help each other. And it's all part of the greater Muskegon area. So while the downtown is being revitalized, there are a lot of parts of Muskegon, especially Muskegon Heights, that still have a lot of need for being brought in and to the fold so that we can all kind of come up together